Back in the last few months of 2023, Airfix decided to release a surprise model kit. And it was this, the 1/72nd scale Messerschmitt Me410 in 1/72nd scale. I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me as I build and review this model kit, but with a slight twist. Let's get into it. So full disclosure, this model kit was provided free of charge by Airfix for the purpose of review. However, all opinions do remain my own. Thanks to Airfix for supplying this review sample. I have already done an unboxing video on this particular kit where I take a deeper look inside the box at the sprues, the plastic parts and the included instructions and transfers. So if you want to know more about that, take a look at that dedicated video. In this video I'll be focusing on what the kit is like to build and my finished results at the end. I'll pop a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy having a go at this one yourself. And as I'm sure you can probably tell by the product list and the title of this video, I've decided to twist this ever so slightly this time. So when I build models, I tend to mix my products as I go through. I use different brands. However, Airfix and Humbrol have a long-standing relationship and they actually fall within the same hobby group at the moment, so it makes sense that on the side of every box you get a Humbrol paint colour callout. And I don't always use Humbrol, but I thought for this brand new kit it would be interesting to see how well I can do using exclusively Humbrol painting products and other bits and pieces. And believe it or not, I've actually spent quite a bit of money, over £50, on Humbrol products for this build, so let's see how well it fares. As usual, I will be cutting away the parts from the sprue using my sprue cutters and cleaning up any rough areas with a sanding stick or a knife. Believe it or not, these are actually Humbrol sanding sticks. I didn't know they made them, but they do. That being said though, there isn't particularly much in the way of flash that will need cleaning up on this kit, as the moulding is pretty good. I have spent a little extra money on this kit, and this is for the painting mask set from CT scale models. This has a pre-cut masking sheet for all of the clear parts, and a lot of them will also do inside and outside of the clear parts if that's how you want to do it. These simply peel and stick onto the relevant components, and they are correctly sized, so it's a matter of just putting them in the right place. Here I'm applying these masks to the internal little window which goes at the bottom of the cockpit. As I'm using Humbrol products for this build, I'm going to be using the liquid poly, which, although not necessarily my favourite cement, I think it will do the job. But I am going to use this small fine-tipped Humbrol paintbrush to apply it, as the brush inside the lid of the pot isn't that good. I carefully joined the clear part into its respective place inside the cockpit component, making sure to not get the glue in the wrong place and fog up the plastic. And then this was joined onto the guns that go in the nose. The internal cockpit then has the backrest and the control column for the pilot added to the assembly. It is worth noting that no crew figures are actually included in this kit, however. Following on from this, there are some smaller details which are also glued into place, and a rear bulkhead component. The rear of the cockpit has a few small details added into their relevant holes as well, and then this rear cockpit part is glued to the front cockpit part. There are some more extra details for the rear gunner and his station, and all of these parts will be glued into the fuselage a little bit later. Here I'm drilling out the holes for the underwing fuel tanks. Inside the lower half of the wing are some locators for where you need to drill, and as you can see there are extra ones, so no doubt there will be a later release with extra parts in the future for something else. With that done, I glued this bracing component into the lower part of the wing, and then the rear gunner station is glued into the mounting holes that are provided for it. Before I start closing things up, there are some parts that need to be glued inside of the landing gear bay wells, so these were added at this point. Inside the main fuselage there are some small details which also have to be glued into place, and it was done at this point. I'm effectively breaking this build down into sub-assemblies to make it easier to paint things a little bit later. And speaking of painting, it's time to prime. So here I am using Humbrol No. 1 acrylic primer, which is a grey paint and it comes in a spray can. This was applied to the assemblies that I've already completed in preparation for some internal painting. When that was done, Humbrol 79, which is a blue-grey enamel, was thinned down with some enamel thinners. I am doing a mix of enamel and acrylic in this build, mostly because that's kind of a few things that I have in my stash, and also I've not really used enamels in a while, so it'd be nice to see how they do. I thinned this paint down in roughly equal parts, and then carefully hand-painted it onto all of the internal areas of the aircraft. I found that due to the primer, I actually only needed to put one coat of this paint down for good coverage. But because it's enamel, it does have an extended drying time, which I did have to account for. The cockpit assembly would also receive a coat of this paint. Humbrol 240, which is a RLM02 grey colour, was then used on the internal gun bay on the nose. 56 aluminium was used to pick out the rudder pedals for the pilot. This was then followed by some of the control panels and the control stick being picked out in 33 matte black. There are some transfers that need to go on the inside of the cockpit, and these were applied at this stage when the paint was dry. I will be using decal fix to help apply these and soften them down into the surface, but I'll go into more depth on that particular step much later on, so that's something to look forward to. When that was completed, I used some Humbrol blue-grey enamel wash to add a bit of shadow and contrast to these details inside the cockpit. You'll be able to notice here that the small detail at the rear of the cockpit has been picked out in number 62 leather. And in the gun bays, I've picked out the cannon barrels in 33 black, and some of the pipework in 54 brass. When all of that was dry, I did some dry brushing using the No. 1 grey primer, but this time this is the version from the acrylic bottle and not out of the spray can. Using a larger brush than before, this was carefully dry brushed over all of the raised details to try and highlight them a little bit. When that was done, I glued into place the pilot's chair and also the chair for the gunner. I carefully peeled away the masks which are on the inside of the cockpit. I think this clear part was here to help the pilot see through the floor for any potential targets. I then started to install these cockpit assemblies inside of the fuselage. The design of the parts is actually quite impressive, and I've not really noticed any areas yet where I've had to cut things away or sand things down to make them fit. Everything so far almost feels as if it's snapping together. There is a small barrel-like object which needs to go in the centre of the aircraft, which is where I will mount the rear-facing machine guns a little bit later. Be careful you don't glue this in, as there is supposedly the design functionality that these can pivot, but I'm not too worried about that, so if I mess it up, it's not too much of a problem. With the fuselage now joined together, I added this onto the lower wing assembly, and once again everything just seems to fit seamlessly. The upper wing parts were then glued into position here, and I glued the leading edge slats in a closed position. However, you do have the option to glue them in an open position if you prefer. The tail surfaces come in two halves which simply need gluing together. You do get an option for a level elevator position or a drooping elevator position, and I opted to go for the drooping version. I then glued the rudder and the horizontal tail surfaces into place on the rear of the aircraft. The engine nacelles are a relatively simple affair, simply coming in two halves which are joined together, and then the radiator air intakes being glued into position on the bottom. These were then also added onto the model in the correct places. Here I'm gluing the lower gun pod into position on its relevant component, and I've already painted them the relevant colours off screen as indicated in the instructions. This assembly was then glued into place on the bottom of the nose of the aircraft, and so far I've been incredibly impressed with the fit of all the parts of this kit. I've not had any gaps or any areas where I've had to excessively sand things in order to get them to fit. Here, however, is where I noticed my first gap. So right at the front of the wing root there are these two small gaps on either side, and I thought, that's perhaps a small little error here, and I was about to fill it until we did some research. Well, when I say we, I mean Sully. Sully from Sully's Scale Model actually did some research for me. Isn't that right?
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, I've seen the kit being built a few times already, and people have been mentioning a few gap issues. Now, the ones that Matt has just pointed out, now these ones are actually supposed to be there. Now, the Messerschmitt Me410 sports 4 forward-facing machine guns, two 7.92mm MG17s, and two 20mm cannons, which are MG151s. These weapons are loaded into the bomb bay. Now, obviously, with machine guns, we want areas for the spent ammunition cases to be spent. Now, these are exactly what these are for. The weapons are based just underneath the pilot's seat and aligns with the ejection slips and the ammunition box placed above. Both ammo boxes are said to sit behind the pilot's seat, one in front of the other. So we have here the machine gun ammo box. You can see the slip there. There'll be a tray that connects to the weapon, and then another tray that leads out into the ejection slip for the machine gun. And behind that, as it says, the 20mm ammo box, its chute, again leading into the weapon, and another tray leading out into the ejection slip to eject the spent rounds. And here we can see the ejection slips from the outside of the aircraft. In the bomb bay doors, there's also cut-in ejection slips. These are for the weapons packs that will be able to be fitted into the bomb bay rather than carrying a bomb load. These could be loaded out with either MG151 20mm, again to further the two 20mm cannons that are already in the airframe, Mark 108 30mm cannons, or they could fit in the BK5 50mm cannon, which obviously is the one that you can use within this kit. So there you go. There's your brief history lesson on the Messerschmitt Me410's weapons loadout. So I'll hand you back over to Matt, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this model turns out.
Thanks, Sully, for that fascinating quick look at the weapon systems on an Me410. So yeah, if that gap's supposed to be there, I'll probably just carry on then. Don't forget as well to check out Sully's channel after this video. And so at this point now, I'm gluing together the underwing radiators, and it comes in a number of parts, but you do need to make sure you put the right parts in the right way round. And I had a few issues here, not because of the kit, but purely because I misread the instructions and put some of the parts together upside down when they should have been a different way round, which has, in the end, when I installed it into the kit, made it look a little bit untidy. Some of the joins are not quite as neat as the rest of the model, but that was my fault and not the fault of the kit. So yeah, make sure you pay attention to the instructions, I suppose. As with some of the other options you get in this kit, you can display the radiator flaps in a more open or closed version, depending on your preference. With that done, I glued into place the counterweights for the ailerons, and then these two were glued into position on the wings. The engine exhausts were glued into position in their slots on the sides of the nacelles, but I won't glue the shrouds in until a bit later because I'm going to paint them separately. The propellers were then glued into their spinners and the retaining part at the back glued into place. And again, if you're careful with your glue, you can have a propeller that freely rotates once you've finished this kit. Airfix have also designed it so that these propellers can be painted off the model before adding them later. Here I've used the CT scale model's masks to protect the nose glazing, and some Humbrol clear fix was used to glue it into position on the aircraft. And with that done, I moved on to the internal frames which go inside of the cockpit and potentially help the cockpit canopy stay in position, I'm guessing. These were glued onto both sides of the aircraft and have previously been painted the same colour as the cockpit. The rear gun sight and controls for the gunner were then glued into place as well, having previously been painted off camera. Now it's time to glue together the 3-part glazing for the cockpit canopy. So I know people have struggled with this, various people online on social media have pointed out their issues with it, and I found the best way for me was to glue it together as a whole before adding it onto the model. And because there's quite a lot of this clear plastic to glue together, I'm going to use poly cement, which I know is a bit risky, but I think that if I use Airfix and I start messing around with it, the bond will not be quite as strong and it could disintegrate over time. So the poly cement, if I'm careful, fingers crossed, should give a stronger bond. But I do run the risk of leaving marks and potentially fogging up the plastic. So it's a sort of risk versus reward endeavour here. With the canopy now glued together, I peeled and stuck on the rest of the masking tape. And now to install it onto the model, I am going to use Humbrol Airfix. This is a clear gel-like glue. It's a bit stringy, so you have to be careful with the application, but it should dry clear and strong, if a little bit slower than normal glues. And with the canopy very carefully placed into position, I moved on when the glue had dried a little bit. I installed this small part underneath the aircraft along the seam of the fuselage, and then joined together the external drop tanks. The support struts for these drop tanks were glued into the holes on the top of the tanks. And with that done, it's time to prime once again. So everything that's now been assembled and everything that's still waiting to be added to the model is primed with the spray paint that I've used previously. And when that was done, I moved on to painting the lower side of the aircraft. So I've actually opted to use my airbrush for this, and I'm using a Gallery 98 Dual for this one. Once again, thanks to Gallery for sending this out as a review sample, but opinions do remain my own. The paint that I'm using is Humbrol, as is every paint product that I've used so far in this kit, and it's of an older generation. This is a Humbrol 247 RLM 76 light blue, which I have thinned down with Humbrol acrylic thinners. However, because it's an older generation, it's not necessarily up to the same quality of the current versions of paints you can get from the Humbrol store or other retailers. The problem I had with these older Humbrol paints was that they are particularly grainy, so no matter how much thinning I would do with this particular paint, I would find that it would clog the airbrush. So I had to change my airbrush out to its 0.5mm nozzle and thin the paints down as much as I could without making them really watery. So the paints at this point posed the most of a problem. They were definitely the trickiest part of the build. When the lower sides of the aircraft had been painted, I moved on to RLM 75, which is a grey violet, and this was Humbrol 246. Once again, having the same kinds of issues that I had with the light blue paint. I tried my hand at free spraying the sides of the aircraft, and I think it's worth pointing out at this point here that the sides of the aircraft are painted the lower light blue colour. However, if you look in the instructions, the paint scheme in the instructions makes it appear that it's a different colour because it's not the same colour as indicated for the lower sides. So the sides have a different shade than the lower surfaces of the aircraft, which I found to be quite misleading, and I did have to ask a few people and they confirmed that the sides of the aircraft should be the same colour as the lower one. A little bit confusing from the instructions there from Airfix, but we overcame it. I did find that because I was using a 0.5mm needle and nozzle, that the spraying wasn't particularly neat, so I went back over the top with my paintbrush just to tidy things up a little bit, the paint having been thinned down appropriately to do this. And another product I didn't know Humbrol made was masking tape, so I've bought some of their rolls of different thickness and I'll be using this in the next step. I used this masking tape to create the camouflage pattern which would be on the upper surfaces. These top surfaces were then sprayed with Humbrol number 245, which is a RLM 74 grey-green. Once that was done, I carefully peeled away the masking tape, but because of the increased amount of thinner that I had to use, I have had some paint bleed underneath the tape, which I don't normally experience. I would go back and correct this with my paintbrush a little bit later. Towards the rear of the aircraft there is a little variation to the paint scheme according to the instructions, and some number 241, which is an RLM 70, was used freehand here just to pick out those relevant bits of the camouflage. I also used this paint on the propellers and spinners. This Humbrol clear gloss varnish, which I believe is acrylic, can be loaded straight into your airbrush or painted on by hand. I've already painted the wheels black, but apparently the instructions indicate that the centre should be more glossy, so I used that gloss varnish here. It would then also be airbrushed onto the entire aircraft that I've already painted in preparation for the transfers liking a nice smooth surface to prevent any silvering of the transfer film. A few thin coats of this varnish would be needed. And speaking of the transfers, these are manufactured by Cartograph and they are printed to an exceptional quality. I cut the decal sheet into more manageable pieces before getting to work with them. They were dipped into warm water and allowed to release from the backing paper. And I will be using decal fix to help apply them. So the decal fix is painted onto the aircraft in the relevant place where the transfer is going to be applied. The transfer is then slid off the backing paper and into position with some fine adjustments as appropriate. Some more decal fix can then be brushed over the top of the transfers to help soften them into the surface of the model. I do find you have to be a little bit more careful with Humbrol decal fix because it can be a little bit glossy and be a little bit sticky, so I did have to take a little bit of extra care with this particular product. The ones that I really struggled with were the transfers that go on the spinner. So these spirals, they do go onto the model, but I found that I had to use repeated applications of the decal fix to get them to soften and conform to the awkward shape. It is possible, but I probably put on like 8, 9, 10 coats of this, periodically waiting for it to dry, then brushing it down with the brush and then applying some more. So this was quite a time-consuming step. The rest of the decals though I didn't really have any problems with. There are quite a lot of small stencils and things, so if you're not a fan of stencils or lots of transfers, maybe this isn't quite the right kit for you, but to be honest you could just leave them off and it would look fine anyway. Some of them are probably a little bit too small to be noticed from a distance, as it is. And after I'd applied the decals and left them to completely cure and dry out, it was time to clear coat them once again with that acrylic clear varnish. This will help seal them in and protect them from the next stages. This Humbrol blue-grey enamel wash, which I also used on the internal cockpit areas, was thinned down with some enamel thinners. I find that straight out of the bottle it's much too thick of a product to be usable, so I tend to thin it down quite a lot. This really thin wash was then brushed over the entire aircraft and allowed to run into all those recessed details and panel lines. That gloss varnish I already applied will help with that. And when that was dry, I wanted to return the aircraft to a more matte finish. I don't believe the aircraft would have been particularly glossy in real life, so I'm going to dull it down. I've bought the counterpart to the gloss varnish, which is the matte varnish. I'm pretty sure they are the same product though, but the matte varnish has an extra pigment in it. However, that being said, I found that even after 3, 4, 5 coats of this matte varnish through the airbrush, it wasn't really doing anything. The aircraft still looked really glossy, so I'm not completely convinced with this particular product. I instead opted to go for something that I know does work. And that is Humbrol number 49 acrylic varnish, which is just the plain clear matte varnish which I've used a number of times on other builds. And this was sprayed straight out of the can over the aircraft maybe 2-3 times, and I got the desired effect I was looking for. So I'd probably, moving forwards, be inclined to get the rattle can over the clear matte varnish. With that done, I picked out the gun barrels on the nose and the engine exhausts with Humbrol 53 gunmetal. The tail wheel, which I've already painted off screen, was glued into place at the back of the model, and this was joined by the rear landing gear bay doors. I did find that these were a little bit fragile and had to glue them together a couple of times during this build. That bar across the middle is quite thin and it snapped a few times. The main landing gear legs were then carefully added into position in the main landing gear bay wells, taking my time to carefully position the support strut. With that in place, I could glue the little door which goes at the front of the leg. And then the wheels were glued onto these legs. The drop tanks were glued into position in those holes I drilled out much earlier in the build on the lower side of the aircraft. This footstep for the crew was glued into position in the down orientation. You can glue this in a raised position if the aircraft was in flight. And so too was this little antenna added to the lower side of the model. The gun barrels were glued into their blisters, which will go on the side of the aircraft, everything having already been painted with the appropriate colour. And whilst that glue is curing, I installed the shrouds that go over the tops of the engine exhausts. In real life, these would have prevented the pilot from being blinded at night and also reduced the visibility of the aircraft whilst it was in operation. The machine gun blisters were then glued into their barrel on the side of the aircraft. Again, this does have the functionality to pivot if you're careful with your assembly. Mine kind of did, but I thought it would ruin the paintwork if I played with it too much. The pitot tube was glued into its slot on the leading edge of the wing, and I cemented the aerial mast on top of the cockpit canopy. The propellers were installed into the front of the engine nacelles, and then just like with the cockpit earlier, I applied some more of the light grey paint, which was dry brushed over the aircraft to help bring out any of those raised details that may be present on the aircraft and to give it a slightly chipped look. And to take this effect a little bit further, I applied some chipping using the sponge method. I dabbed some paint onto a sponge and then carefully used this to simulate chipping over different areas of the aircraft, particularly places where perhaps the air has forced the paint away due to the resistance of the air, or areas which the mechanics may have inadvertently damaged around panels which they access frequently. This Humbrol gloss oil stain wash was then applied in a streaking kind of method to the areas which I thought perhaps would have had engine oil or fuel or other elements like that applied to them, just to add another layer of wear and tear to this aircraft. Humbrol did a few years ago give me a free sample of this weathering powders pack, so I'm going to use some of these here as well. These are very fine pigments, and I opted to use the smoke one around the areas of the engine exhaust and the gun ports to simulate exhaust staining and gun smoke. A small amount of pigment would be applied to a dry brush and then streaked in the direction of airflow across the aircraft. Repeated applications of these pigments would help build up the effect. I painted the internal area of the landing light with some 56 aluminium, and then when that was dry, I glued the clear part into place there. The final step was to carefully remove the CT scale model's masks which I've used on the canopy, and with that I'm calling my build of the Airfix Me410 in 1/72 scale complete. So, what do I think of this model? Well, if I'm being honest, there was a lot of good stuff here. Like, I wouldn't necessarily say that I loved it, but it's almost there. The issues with this kit that I found a little bit tedious, and this is purely talking about the kit, was the amount of stencils. I found that quite time consuming and dull. I also personally, so this is probably not a representation of the kit, but I sometimes find German Luftwaffe camouflage schemes to be a little bit daunting, and I actually was putting this one off. I know Airfix sent it to me to review, and I was putting it off because of the slightly complicated paint scheme, but I then thought to myself, you just need to build it. You just need to get it out of your stash and build it. And ultimately, I think on the whole, it looks all right. So the really good things about this kit, I think the instructions were easy to follow. However, there was that issue with the painting instructions. As previously mentioned, the lower side of the aircraft and the side of the aircraft should be the same color, but in those instructions they are slightly different shades, which I think could lead to a bit of confusion. If they'd used the same color throughout, maybe it would have been easier for us to understand. But yeah, so the lower side should be the light blue, and the sides as well, with the then different color camouflage on the top. I think the only part that I had issue with was the landing gear door that goes on the back of the aircraft for the tail wheel. It has that little connecting rod, and I snapped it a few times, and whilst it's not a big issue, maybe there was a better way of having that in the kit, but you know, it's easily overcome. Whilst I know some people have really struggled with the canopy, I don't think I really did. Yes, there may be some glue marks from my choice to use liquid poly during this build to glue those clear parts together on the finished kit, which, you know, in hindsight, I've had a bit more time. I could have used Clearfix and avoided that, but I think gluing the parts together off the model, then installing it as a single piece onto the aircraft is probably the right way to go about it. And talking about building the model, like, I've never had an Airfix kit that builds together as well as this one has. It's almost as if everything just snaps together. You think to yourself, that's a really funny shape, the way those parts are designed, and then you slide it into place and it clicks in and it's done, and it's almost seamless. Like, I have Humbrol model filler, which I had got ready for this kit, and I didn't use a drop of it. Like, I don't even remember sanding the seams down because they were that flush once I'd glued them together. So the design of this kit is very impressive. That being said, it is a bit disappointing that there's no crew, because the option to have this in flight is included in the model. So if you wanted to have this one flying, you would have to add your own pilot and gunner. So the areas where I struggled then, and probably with the paints. I think I took this relatively easy to assemble kit. If you've got a bit of previous knowledge, it's not too difficult, and I made it a little bit harder with my choice of paints. The paints I struggled with the most were the older generation Humbrol acrylics, and those were particularly the light blue, the dark grey, the dark green, all of the stuff which was the camouflage scheme, so the stuff you're going to see on the outside of the model. The other paints, I've got some of the newer Humbrol Gen 2, such as the black, the silver, and a few other colours like that. They were fine, but they're on the inside of the aircraft, or just in a small odd few places here and there, so you know, they're not as noticeable as the overall paint scheme. I found the older RLM colours to be grainy, hence the 0.5mm nozzle, which resulted in it not being as accurate with my airbrushing, and the thinner that I had to use increased the drying time, and then I had to go back and clean things up with my paintbrush, so it was a little bit backwards and forwards in that respect, and it probably took me about an hour just to figure out the ratio that I needed for my paint to be thinned enough to go through the nozzle without clogging it. So yeah, I think perhaps in the future I'd look at getting, well, if I was going to use Humbrol again, I'd get the later generation 2 version, because they do have finer pigments. Normally though, I would use a mix and match of different brands based on my previous experiences. I found the clear gloss acrylic varnish to be absolutely fine. You can paint that on with a brush or put it straight through the airbrush, and that was fine. That's a product I'll definitely use again in the future. However, the matte varnish, which comes in the glass bottle, I didn't really see it being particularly matte. It didn't take the gloss shine down at all, so I used a rattle can for that in the end, and the rattle can works absolutely fine. So the clear matte, probably wouldn't use that again. So I'm just looking through my journal, which is a book I've written specifically to help modelers like me. It's just a book where you can keep track of everything that you're doing during a build, the paints that you've used, information about the kit, such as its tooling age and its price and stuff like that, just to see if I've missed anything. And if you want one of these, feel free to have a look at my Amazon shop, because you can help support the channel directly by purchasing one of these or some of the other books I've written. But anyway, I have taken 9 days to build this kit, so it wasn't exactly the fastest kit in the world, but as most of you know, I do have a full-time job and family outside of modelling, so things can take a little while. But then again, most of that was taken up by the longer drying times of the enamel paints that I used and the acrylic with the thinner. I also didn't rush this kit because I wanted to take my time to really understand how the parts fit together, because they fit together really well. And like I said, it's almost like a jigsaw puzzle sometimes. You think that's not going to fit in, and then it clicks and it's done and it's seamless. But yeah, so I think the final note that I wrote in this book was, great kit, shame about some of the paints. I think it's probably time to round this one off. This is a kit that was tooled and released for 2023, so it's one of the most recent Airfix kits, retailing at the time this video was made for £23.99. Personally, I don't think that's a bad price for what you're getting inside the box. Not only are you getting some comprehensive instructions, which I found to be relatively easy to follow, cartograph transfers which are of an exceptional quality, and 137 plastic parts which are moulded to a good quality as well, with no flash or sink marks that I could see, all designed to a very high standard where the parts just snap together. If you haven't built an Airfix kit for a number of years now and were used to how they were in the old days, perhaps this is something to look at, because it might well convince you that they are not necessarily the same company they were 20 years ago. And on that bombshell, I think it's probably time to end this one here. I had a lot of fun building this kit, and I'm glad that I finally have. It'll be interesting to see what Airfix releases for 2024 as a surprise model. As always, I'd like to give a shout out to my channel members and patrons. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, I spent over £50 on Humbrol products just for this project, so without these guys on screen, I don't think I'd be able to do that. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the latest members to the club. They are Stuart, TPS Models, Chris Newman and Alex Old. Welcome to the club. If you'd like to know more about how you can support the channel and join the people on screen here, take a look at the links in the description. Alternatively, there are other ways you can help support the channel, and again, full information is below the video. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling video. Thanks to Sully for the history lesson on the Me410 earlier on, and clearing up that issue I had with the gap at the front of the lower side of the aircraft. Don't forget to check out Sully's channel after this video too. Finally though, I think it's probably time to say goodbye. I'm aware that this is going to be quite a long video, and it probably has taken me quite a while to edit. So the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. And I'll see you on the workbench. Oh no, I haven't said about subscribing. People need to subscribe. How else are they going to get notifications? And these videos take so long to make that I just forget so much stuff. I already stopped recording and I had to go back. Let's edit this bit in. Thanks to Sully for the Oh my word! What am I saying? What did he do? He did the thing. Thanks to Sully for the. And that'll do. That's the video. Video's done.